The African American Legends series highlights the accomplishments of blacks in areas as varied as politics, sports, aviation, business, and the military. We will explore how African Americans have succeeded in areas where they had been previously excluded because of segregation, racism, and lack of opportunity. I am your host, Dr. Roscoe C. Brown, Jr., and joining us on today's program is Michael Handy, Director of the New York City Office of Veterans Affairs, and we'll be talking about the exploits of black veterans. We'll be talking about how this office serves black veterans. And Michael, glad to have you with us today. And could you tell us a little about the Office of Veterans Affairs? Many municipalities and states have them, but New York City has one of the premier Office of Veterans Affairs. And tell us what you do and how you serve veterans, particularly African American veterans.
Well, yes, sir. Thank you very much for having me on. And in particular, I want to thank you for being an African American legend and being a military legend. And so it just adds a little bit more to this event for me personally. The Mayor's Office of Veteran Affairs is approximately 48 years old. We've had an Office of Veteran Affairs of varying sizes since World War II. Today, we're a much smaller office than we ever have been. And we basically serve, there are 400 veteran organizations in New York City. There are more than 500,000 veterans from all eras and all wars. And ours is more or less a referral agency. I act as a troubleshooter for veterans who are employed by the city. As you know, we have about 15 major city agencies. We have a workforce in the millions in New York City government. And I work with veterans in these agencies who are having difficulties with their veterans credits or troubleshooting essentially with the city agencies. Also, I'm the liaison to these 400 veterans organizations. We have Ukrainian veterans, we've got Black, Latino veterans, we've got women veterans from every war, from every era. And their needs vary from a World War II veteran who might be female getting a particular type of service at the VA Medical Center to a female Persian Gulf vet who may be a female head of the household and looking for an apartment or a job, or trying to reestablish themselves in the city after being in the military for X amount of time. As you know, we have a number of special events, and my office coordinates those special events. The magnitude is anything from a dinner dance for a VFW post to the major 50th anniversary of World War II parade that we had last year. As a matter of fact, we're looking forward to the 50th anniversary of Korea right now. And the ball is beginning to roll kind of slowly at this point, but the impetus is mounting towards that Korean War memorial that'll be happening in 3 years or so.
The interesting thing about veterans and veterans affairs is how it has changed over time. Almost 11.5 million people served in World War II, and about 1.5 million black folks, and another 3 or 4 million served in Korea, and similar numbers in Vietnam. And at one time, it was very important for someone to be a veteran, to get the benefits, to get an education, to run for political office, etc. But with the advent of peace, fortunately, the numbers of veterans people serving has declined. Consequently, the number of veterans have declined. Yet the problems that veterans face are still there.
Oh, yes, sir.
There are certain controversies that go around. Should veterans get extra credit on civil service examination? Should they get extra credit for promotion? The theory being that they risked their lives and took a certain portion of time out of their lives to defend their country. The public isn't always as sympathetic with that today.
Oh, absolutely. And it's not only today, sir. I mean, if you look back over our history from the Revolutionary War forward, World War II and the benefits that you received and your colleagues in World War II received is or was the anomaly. The first riots in the United States were the script riots when the Revolutionary War soldiers found out that the money that they were paid was no good. the reason, for example, that the World War II veteran and the Korean War veteran in particular got, let's say, substantial benefit was because the World War I veterans were demonstrating because they felt that the federal government had ignored them when they came back from the war.
It's very interesting. I grew up in Washington, D.C., and one of my vivid memories when I was a child were the bonus marches
Yes, sir.
of World War I veterans.
Yes, sir.
And they set up tents down in the mall, etc., so that the awareness, the consciousness of the importance of veterans, particularly since practically everyone had somebody in the military in World War II, was there. Now, how did you get you obviously very knowledgeable and committed, how did you get interested in serving veterans as a government official?
Well, sir, my service to veterans actually began, or at least the mindset began on the day that I got back home from Vietnam. They were anti-war protesters in the airport when we got there. I was so happy to be home and to have survived. And I felt that these anti-war protesters really intruded on my own personal homecoming. I began to find that there were other veterans who felt the same way. I went to City University, and there was a cadre of Vietnam vets, former combat vets who were there. We all kind of got together. We had so many things in common. And so that my course really started about the day that I got off of the plane. For 20 years, working in Veterans Affairs was my avocation. I worked for the City of New York in various capacities and did my veterans work at home, off days, weekends, et cetera, et cetera. It was only actually in the Dinkins administration that, and again, it was around the time that the Persian Gulf War was kicking off, that people began to listen to what I had to say, I suppose. And I elevated to the position. I am very committed. I'm a Vietnam combat veteran. I served in the Central Highlands in the United States Air Force. And we talked earlier about the problems that veterans face. We faced similar types of problems ourselves.
It's very interesting. As you know, I'm a Tuskegee Airman.
Oh, yes, sir.
Flew in World War II and a veteran. And talking about coming home, I remember when we came down the gangplank from the troop ship, there was a white soldier holding a sign that said, "Blacks this way and whites that way." As a result of that, I became both committed to changing the segregation in the country, more so than before, but also became involved in veterans organizations like the American Veterans Committee, because at that time the American Legion was not particularly welcoming of African Americans. Now, of course, they do, which shows how much things have changed.
Times have changed, sure.
But the advocacy for veterans and the awareness of the role of veterans is very important. Now, one of the things that you mentioned, there are some 400 veterans organizations, and that's a lot of organizations. Part of it grows out of the camaraderie that you develop. For example, the Tuskegee Airmen have a national group, 34 chapters, that celebrates our accomplishments and try to show young people, particularly black young people, the importance of hard work and discipline and courage and struggle and the like. But what does your office do to help honor some of these black veterans and these black veterans groups?
Yes, sir. Well, number one, I think we identify them, them and promulgate them. For example, Brigadier General Rosetta Burke. General Burke is the first female general in the 221-year history of America's National Guard. Now, she just happens to be a black woman. Now, again, people should know that General Burke exists, and we make an effort to try to at least promulgate the fact that among us, walking among us, and doing great things is this person who is a genuine historic figure.
But of course, you used the phrase, happens to be black. That's something that says, well, she is very good, and she's also black.
Also black.
But on the other hand, what you didn't say is that being an African American in any area, even in the 1997, 98 period, that you have to be damn good.
Oh, absolutely.
And because the Army, for example, is very good in trying to promote African Americans. I believe they're the only bureaucracy in the country that has about the same proportion of minorities and African Americans in the upper ranks as they have in the enlisted ranks.
Yeah.
And that's certainly due to the policies of people like Bill Clinton and the work of people like Rodney Coleman and Togo West, who's the
absolutely Secretary of the Army,
and goes back actually to Clifford Alexander back in the Carter administration.
Right.
But it's just interesting that even today, that when an African American achieves something that no one else has achieved in their race, they are identified as African Americans. And I think those of us who are African Americans are very proud of that.
Oh, absolutely.
At the same time, we recognize that this is a country that has many, many hundreds of ethnic and racial groups, and that all of them contribute, and that African Americans for so long have fought to be recognized as people first. But at the same time, our heritage comes with us, because every time a general achieves, it is because of the fact that some of us have gone before and continued the advocacy. And that's one of the things you advocate. But let's talk about some of the African American combat units that have achieved great things in terms of the defense of this country. I guess you can go all the way back to the Rhode Island Regiment in the Revolutionary War.
Oh, yes, sir. And as a matter of fact, you may know that the Black Patriots Memorial is being planned for Washington, D.C.
So tell us about the Black Patriots Memorial.
Well, basically, it is a memorial to the African Americans who fought during the Revolutionary War. It's a beautiful, a striking monument. I've seen the mock-up version of it. It traces African Americans from the time that they essentially got off the slave ship, and ends with a Revolutionary War soldier, a black man in his Revolutionary War regalia, standing proud, so that it's important that our youngsters, my kids, my girls, my children, recognize the contributions that have been made, not in World War II, not in World War I, but since the beginning of this nation.
And the fact that every time we did it, we had to do it over the protest.
Oh, yes, sir.
George Washington did not want African-American troops.
Right.
Neither did Abraham Lincoln
Right.
in the Civil War.
Right.
Until such time as
they needed them.
Well, two things. As they needed them, and racism has cut a broad swath across this country.
Yes, sir.
Not every white person, every white group has been prejudiced.
Right.
And given those lines in the Constitution, preamble, all men are created equal, there are, there's always been a certain number of people who believe that.
Oh, yes,
and
sir.
hopefully, even today, more people believe it. Hopefully, at some point in time, everyone will believe it.
And when you come back from combat, that's when you believe it more than anything else. When you've served and you've put yourself in harm's way, and you come back here and you realize that you are equal, you realize that you have a legacy to fall back on, you have a future in front of you. One of the great things in particular is when we talk about the Tuskegee Airmen or the Montford Point Marines, as you know, Marine training during World War II was segregated, and the white Marines went to Parris Island, and the
everything
black Marines,
in World War II was segregated, Michael. Let's remember that. Okay.
But the black Marines went to Montford Point. Gene Dowdy, who is a Montford Point Marine and is one of the survivors of Iwo Jima. You remember that for a long time the media, the society didn't acknowledge the fact that there were any blacks on Iwo Jima. One of our bloodiest confrontations in any war that we've ever had. The 369th Veterans Association.
They go back to World War I.
Yes,
the
sir.
Hell Fighters from Harlem.
Yes, sir.
The Men of Bronze.
Yes, sir.
Who fought longer in the trenches than any American unit. And yet, at the same time, those very people were discriminated against when they came back
Yes, sir.
to New York. And the thing that we have to balance, it's difficult to balance, is all people being created people. All people are created equal, but all people aren't treated equal in our society. And one of the real challenges is to do that, and the veterans movement makes it possible
Yes.
for this to occur.
Yes.
Those benefits, those health benefits, et cetera, are very important, although as the number of veterans decline and the participation in the military declines, Congress and others have attempted to cut back. Cut back on Veterans Hospital. They claim there were too many. Maybe they were, I don't know. But they cut back on Veterans Hospital. It isn't so much cutting back on the number, but you can't cut back on the quality of the service.
Right.
And the quality of service, some have said, is not still equal.
Oh, yes, it's
for
beginning to suffer.
particularly low-income veterans, particularly veterans of color. I imagine that's part of your advocacy.
Oh, yes, sir. As a matter of fact, the federal government at this point is looking at shifting the cost for services. For example, if you get a tonsillectomy in Tucson, Arizona, it might cost $500. If you get that same tonsillectomy in New York City, it would cost $1,000. What the federal government is trying to do is to even out the cost for services, and if they get their way, New York City will only get $500 for a tonsillectomy.
For a veteran.
For a veteran. So that essentially means that their services are cut.
Well, how do you resolve that? Because healthcare, of course, is one of the major issues, and there are clear regional differences in expenditures.
Exactly.
So does that mean you send a veteran to Tucson to
Well,
get the operation?
Ideally, we resolve it through the actions and the activities of the veterans organizations that operate here. The American Legion, for example, is one of the largest veterans organizations in the country. They've come up with a recommendation called the GI Bill of Health, and it's a program that the American Legion feels will stabilize the kinds of services that might be available. It's incumbent upon the veterans organizations around the country, and certainly here in New York City, to communicate to their political representatives that it's kind of like serving your country, going through the changes necessary to be a veteran, to be a combat veteran, and then when you come out, the federal government changes the deal, it changes the contract, it changes the ball game. And what's happening, therefore, is that veterans approach these issues with righteous indignation. Sometimes that indignation serves us very well. Other times it allows, let's say, those who aren't supporting our positions to paint us into a corner. The federal government, I believe, and I'm sure you believe, and I'm sure that anyone who has been in a foxhole or
flown an airplane and gotten shot
at. Or dove for cover during a mortar attack or whatever, appreciates what an individual goes through when they enter combat. The difficulty is that once you come back out, nobody really cares except the veterans.
One of the things that some researchers have found is that the GI Bill of Rights has been the best investment this country has ever made.
Had been, yes, sir, I agree.
Because of the fact that literally millions of veterans were retrained, got educations, got degrees, PhDs, medical degrees, lawyers, etc. That built an educated infrastructure for the society,
whole nation. Yes, sir.
For the nation, and the return on investment is several times.
Yes, sir. Hundreds of thousands of
what
doctors.
can we do to bring that to light? Because I think part of it has to do with the fact that, particularly in Vietnam, a significant number of the working force were lower-income minority people. And many middle-income people managed to avoid it by getting college deferments or going to Canada. And there isn't as much sympathy to the Vietnam vet and more recently to the Persian Gulf vet.
Yes, sir.
What can we do to help bridge that gap and develop an understanding of the fact that those veterans deserve the same benefits as the veterans of World War II?
Well, so look, my dad fought in World War II. When he came out, he could have gone to any college that he qualified for. They would have paid his books, they would have paid his tuition. With a family, they would have given him a stipend to live off campus, etc. When I came back from Vietnam, I got $220 a month. Now, in 1972, $220 a month sustained me. My rent was $140 a month. I worked part-time and I used my GI Bill. I was in the Air Force, and so I spent 4 years in the military, and I therefore got 4 years worth of educational benefits, and those benefits allowed me to get a master's degree. My oldest daughter is in the Army right now. She's in E6 at Fort Bragg. You've seen the ads, get up to $30,000. Well, a year at Yale is now $28,000. So that the opportunities, and as you say, the benefit that the society received from educating all of our GIs, from allowing them to form businesses and to get that law degree or that medical degree, served this nation very well. And what's happening today is that that benefit is no longer, number one, available to the GI, and number two, available to the society. You get up to $30,000, but a rent in a halfway decent apartment in New York City is going to cost you $1,000, and that's a month.
Well, your resolution to this is to reinstate the GI Bill.
Oh, yes, sir.
Now, of course, when you talk about reinstating anything that costs money, then you get into the budget cycle. And I think the best argument is the fact that the GI Bill pays off in terms of what happens with people's income and their status in life. But we find that there are a number of Vietnam veterans and Gulf War veterans have serious health problems.
Oh, yes,
some
sir.
related to substance abuse, some related to previous problems that they've had. And some people say they couldn't benefit from this and we'd just be throwing money away.
Well,
how do you resolve that?
Right. Well, number one, the services that are available to this afflicted group, let us call it, is not involved with the basic GI Bill benefits. This is more or less a medical benefits issue.
And
so what I'm getting
money for that?
Well, yes, sir. I mean, to the extent that they're cutting back. I mean, we talked about the fact that they're cutting back. But number one, let me say that hundreds of millions of dollars annually are spent by the 5 military services on advertising. Now, if they could take that $100 million, $200, $300 million and redirect it towards benefits for our youngsters, that's your grandkids, my grandkids, it would certainly be a detriment to the young and Rubicons of this country, to the major advertising agencies that handle these contracts. But it would be an advantage incrementally to my kid and to all those other youngsters that are out there aspiring. The one wonderful thing about the military service is that it allows you to grow up. It allows you to see things and experience things that you never would in Bed-Stuy or up in the Bronx. And so I guess, what is it? How are you going to keep them down on the farm after they've seen Paris? There was an opportunity to emerge from that experience. Let me say that in particular our World War II vets, in particular our black World War II vets, they were the impetus for the Civil Rights Movement. They were the impetus for all of those social movements that brought me to where I am today. The cause of justice and righteousness. I mean, these were things that your generation brought to our generation. You went to war, you experienced all of these things, and you came home and said, why can't we be free? Why can't we do these things? I remember the double V for victory, you know, right before
Victory at home and victory abroad.
Victory abroad. My dad told me when I was going to Vietnam, you are going to be fighting for the right to fight here. So we have a legacy here, and what's happening is that some of our federal, or let's say our governmental institutions, are eroding the opportunity for our youngsters to advance at the same degree that you might have advanced or I might have advanced. Our Persian Gulf vets in particular are in the worst shape of any era of veterans since World War II. Mm-hmm. Why? Because number one, there were only 500,000 of them in the combat zone. For New York City, which generates a large number of young men and women going into the service in the first place, that'll translate into about 7,000 or 8,000 Persian Gulf combat veterans in the 5 boroughs. Now, that's a drop in the bucket. They don't have political clout.
All right, as we come to the end of our talk today, what are your main objectives, let's say, in the next 2 years? What do you expect to accomplish? What do you think the big challenge is?
The big challenge is making sure that our youngsters are taken care of. I would like to number one, organize the Persian Gulf veterans. Just as a matter of course, a veteran doesn't get interested in Veterans Affairs until they've got an apartment and they're stable and they've got a job and they can afford to pay those little dues and they can afford to go to a meeting in the evenings. Our youngsters aren't in that position right now. They're out there scrambling. They're still traumatized by the transition from that combat zone back here to the city, trying to find that job and keep a roof over their heads. But my impetus is to try to get them organized as soon as possible because they are the ones that need it more so than anybody else. In Vietnam, we had 10 million people that were served in the military during the Vietnam War era, all right? These youngsters are almost by themselves, and if they don't link up with groups like the Black Veterans for Social Justice in Brooklyn and the El Barrio Post of the American Legion and the New Era Veterans in the Bronx and the Military Order of the Purple Heart, the Colón Rivera chapter of the Military Order of the Purple Heart, they are going to be left out of all of the decisions, as you say, from a society that really doesn't care about the vets much anymore.
It's very clear that you have a tremendous commitment. You also have tremendous knowledge and insight into the problems of the veterans, Black veterans, Latino veterans, white veterans. And I think that the City of New York is very, 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 very pleased to have you and really have somebody who believes in them, and you believe in the veterans. Today we've been talking with Michael Handy, who is the director of the New York City Office of Veterans Affairs. And he has told us just what veterans of all races, particularly African-American veterans, have made to this country, and also the challenges that we face to make life better for them as well as for the rest of this country. Thanks for being with us today, Michael.
Thank you, sir.